Michael, you and I have done this many, many times, to the point where I don't even think we should pretend that we should just think of this as an ongoing conversation and just start in the middle, pick up where we left off. You just whispered to me you wanted to...
Well, I think we have to honor Sean Toohey, because he was going to be another high school classmate who was one of the main characters in The Blind Side. And he was supposed to be in your chair. And the amazing thing about that is Sean Toohey confessed to me that he thinks in his whole life he never read a book. But he had the balls to come and do this, and you were so much more qualified. But I wanted to just sort of pile on myself here and add to what T just said. The Blind Side starts when I fly down to Memphis I was given a talk about something else, and I was thinking about writing something about my high school baseball coach, and I thought I ought to get in touch with old teammates just to see what they thought of him, and Sean was an old teammate. So I called him, he says, I'll pick you up at the airport, and he led me into the Blind Side story. But the first thing he says when he picks me up at the airport, we get in the car, he's like, deadpan, dead serious, he says, so who writes your books? And I said, Sean, I write my books. He goes, no, I know you're like the author, and that your name's on the book, and you're really good on TV. He said he went on about how he admired my promotional abilities. He thought I handled the business end of things. I was out there selling it. He said, but then he says, but who puts the words on the page? And I said, Sean, I put the words on the page. He goes, no, you don't. He said, you're a dumb shit just like me who sat in the back of Dr. Francis's English class and got C's. And it really took him forever. He had in his head, Michael has got this career as an author, but he's got some trolls in the back who do the words for him. Yeah. And he goes out and he gets to be the author. And that was his notion of, because he could not conceive that the person he knew from age 5 to 17 and went to school with had ended up with this writing career. And I think, T's not just making it up. I think that nobody saw this coming, not even me.
Maybe the last author that Sean Toohey picked up at the airport was James Patterson. It was a legitimate question. But does anyone, by the way, help you with your...
Does anybody help me with my words?
No, I'm not since I am impersonating Sean Toohey.
Yeah. Where do those words come from?
No. That's not what I'm asking. But do you have you never use, do you use researchers?
I once hired a researcher because my daughters needed a softball coach. And the softball coach of my dreams could not take the job as a softball coach unless she had a proper job in addition to it. So I said, how would you like to be my research assistant? And then we sat and stared at each other for the next 3 years because I couldn't think of anything for her to do. And it was, the problem I have with any of that kind of help is that it's in doing the sort of stuff a research assistant would do that I figure out what the book is in the first place.
Exactly.
Right? So what are they going to do? There are people who fact check all that stuff after the fact. And there's, of course, I've had the same book editor since Liar's Poker. Since my book I wrote when I was 27 years old. He's still in my life, but he is in his late Monet stage of editing where he kind of sees the words but he's great. It's he sees the big picture, but then the words are kind of my words and you're kind of stuck with my words.
Yeah. Well, this is actually, I've often thought this, all of us do this when we think about professions other than our own, which is we understand the general shape of the profession, but we don't understand how time is allocated within it. So people who aren't doctors think that what doctors do is see patients, but in fact what doctors do is answer lots of emails and do paperwork. Yeah. Or they do see patients, but it's not this much seeing patients and this much paperwork, it's this much paperwork and computer and this much. Writers, people who aren't writers think that writers do this much time writing and this much time preparing for writing. It's the opposite.
Yeah, no, I know there are people, you and I don't know, we're probably exceptions, but there are people who get up and write every day because they have to write, and
Yeah.
and this is mainly novelists, I think, who can do this. I can go months without putting serious words on the page. I find so much of what I do is figuring out what needs to be said. And what's worth saying, and finding characters, and just gathering the stuff. The actual writing of it is, I don't want to say it's the easy part, but it's kind of the easy part. That it's not. That's once you're there and you have it all, it's just really not that hard. So yes, you're right. That if you had a camera on my life and probably your life, it would be very disappointing. Right? We aren't sitting there in a fugue state all by ourselves in a garret thinking thoughts.
Yeah.
You're probably doing that more than I am. You have more thoughts than
No, I don't. I
But,
think
yeah,
I probably
but
have
it's
more-
no.
fewer
But
thoughts.
tell me, how much time do you spend actually sitting down putting words on paper versus everything else?
Not a lot.
Not a lot.
But it's all about it's when you talk to someone, you realize, oh, that person has just written that section for me, right?
Yes.
You know what it's going to look like, but it's finding the kind of, and the order of things. I was watching that movie, I watched the movie Gentleman's Agreement, which I thought was a movie about anti-Semitism. It's actually a movie about Hollywood writers trying to glamorize their profession. And the bulk of the movie is our hero struggling to write a magazine article, and ripping the pages out of his typewriter, screwing them up and throwing them at the wall. That's the good third of the movie. It's just like, did people actually do that?
Not good people. Yeah.
But wait, Michael,
right, so-
I do have some questions that relate. We're in New Orleans, and I was thinking about you because I do this for my sins, this newsletter, and I imagined that I was going to if one were to take a tour of the South and do, Memphis, Atlanta, Birmingham, New Orleans, what 10 books would you read in preparation? So for each city, I gave a list of books and had readers suggest. And for New Orleans, the question was, well, what would the classic New Orleans book be? And I answered, well, the obvious ones. But then I said, and then the real one I want hasn't been written yet. It's the book Michael Lewis writes about New Orleans.
Did you say that?
Did.
In public?
Yeah.
Huh.
Pressure's on.
Huh.
What is the Michael Lewis book about New Orleans?
I've avoided it. I haven't really thought, I came down, I first thought, the only thing meaningful I've ever written about this place was a long magazine piece about Katrina.
Oh, which I'm about to bring up, which was so brilliant and so informed by the fact that you were from New Orleans that I wanted more.
So did I, but I didn't have it. And I came down and I thought, I gathered string. We moved the family down here for 6 months and gathered string, and the string is all in a box. And maybe one day. But, it was such a peculiar childhood that you don't realize is peculiar until you get out of here. And I think that, this place has informed my writing in so many ways, not least of which, I think that all the books it's a person with an odd view of the world coming into a circumstance that nobody recognizes as odd. And the reason I have the odd view of the world is I grew up here.
Yeah.
Not the southernmost city in North America, but the northernmost city in South America. And over and over, I'm reminded of how strange this place was. But I've not spoken to my publisher about writing a book about this place. But coming here during Katrina, I did think the material's pretty good. So right now I'm about to use some. I do a podcast for his company. I'm a wholly owned subsidiary of Malcolm Gladwell and Jacob Weisberg. It's called Against the Rules. It's been a total joy to do. It reaches a completely different audience than the books. It works different muscles. And this season, the idea of the podcast is every season we take a character, an authority figure in American life whose status is volatile and examine what's happened to that character and why. And the first season was about referees in American life. The second season is about coaches. And the third is about experts. And I was sitting around a table with two producers the other day, and they were saying, you know, it would be really nice if we could, like in the past two seasons, you've had things that are kind of personal stories, and they work real well for the ear. Is there any like expertise you developed when you were a kid that we might like, that might be a way in? And I started thinking about like what I actually learned as a child and how different that was from what people in other places might have learned. Like the kind of things, I didn't learn anything practical. I didn't learn how to really do anything that was a vendible skill. I learned the difference between a second cousin once removed and a first cousin twice removed. You know, like nobody in America knows the difference between those two things, but everybody in New Orleans knows the difference between those two things. And I thought, well, there was a moment. I actually had a funny experience where something I learned that I really did learn here, was of interest to the world. And they said, well, what was it? I said, well, when I was 15 years old, I was the king of squires. I was the king of a Mardi Gras organization. And for a period of 6 weeks after baseball practice, I go over to the house of this little old lady near our school whose job was to train royalty. These people still exist in New Orleans. And Mardi Gras kings and queens go to them to learn how to comport themselves, to learn how to sit on a throne. There is a way to sit on a throne, to learn how to greet subjects, to learn how to wave a scepter, things like that, and walk around regally, right? I was learning how to do this. It was taught me with a completely straight face. And the woman who was teaching me explained to me that she'd learned all this stuff in Eastern Europe where she trained actual royalty, but they were all gone. So she had to come here because this was the last place where you found, enough of a customer base.
Yes.
So
you have to know who your customers are. That's
right.
One of the principles of the modern economy.
So flash forward, whatever it is, 20 years, and a friend of mine who edits one of the newspapers in Britain has asked me to come over and cover one of their elections. And I get there, I land, he says, I want you to come to dinner too, there's someone I want you to meet. And he gave me an address that wasn't his house. He said, just show up here at this time. No further instruction. So I show up at this house, I knock on the door, and Princess Diana opens the door. And yes. And it's just her. Uh-huh. And she's on the outs with Charles. And it's a little flat that's down the road from Kensington, or wherever she was supposed to be.
Were you married at the time?
No. And so she opens the door, and my jaw was on the floor. I was just stupid, right? I was just struck dumb. I said, I know who you are. And she leads me into the house, and we're just gonna have a drink together before a dinner party actually does show up, and she goes out the back door. And they were like kibitzing, but what are you gonna say, right, to Princess Diana? And so I said, you and I have something in common. And she said, what? I said, well, we're actually both royalty. You're about to lose that status, but I was king of squires, and I explained to her. That they taught me how to do stuff, and she brightened up. She goes, they haven't taught me how to do anything, and so I said, well, what did they teach you? And I said, well, this and that, and they taught me how to wave a scepter. And she said, you know how to wave a scepter? And I said, yes. And so she said, would you teach me? And so we walked around. She put her hand on my hand, and we walked around. It was a pretty big living room, and we found a couple of forks. And I showed her the way you led with your elbow and then it follows with the wrist, and the way you need to follow with your eyes, and the whole thing. And she was like completely into it. So this is the whole point of this story, in addition to eating up 5 minutes of
I don't think
conversation.
the story needs a point.
Is when I was asked by my podcast producers, what did you learn in New Orleans and become an expert in that might be like that different and get us back to New Orleans? That's the kind of thing I learned. That was it. That's what I had. That's all I had was that kind of thing. And every now and then you pull it out of your back pocket and it works. But most of the time it was a different and sort of impractical childhood.
There's nothing wrong with that.
No, there's nothing wrong with that. No, there's everything right with that. I mean, I would argue that I feel it less and less as I live outside of New Orleans for longer, and I become kind of more assimilated into the rest of into normal American society. But I can remember thinking when I left here and I went to Princeton. It wasn't at Princeton. It was really when I was on the cusp, when I had to leave Princeton and find something to do with myself in the world. And I was watching the way the world was, once you're out of school, and especially it was New York. But everybody wanted to go to work on Wall Street, and everybody's kind of grabbing and getting and worried about their careers. And in this, I came from a place where you really weren't defined by what you did for a living. You really weren't defined. You were defined by who your mama was and what neighborhood you grew up in and what school you went to. And it was genuinely a place that turned on family values. And there was not a whole lot of talk about worldly success. Now, partly because there wasn't a lot of worldly success, but partly because it was just, it was a stagnant. It was somewhere between a stagnant and a stable place. And I tell this often. My father, who's sitting in the front row. This will give you an idea of the spirit, and I've told you this before, that in which I grew up. That up to the age of about 17, he would every now and then say to me, he'd recite the Lewis family motto for me. And he'd tell me it was on the coat of arms, which is preposterous when you hear what the Lewis family motto is, because the coat of arms has like 3 words of Latin in it, whatever they are. Mm-hmm. And he said, and the point of the story is that I believed him, that I thought this was true. He said the Lewis family motto is, do as little as possible, and that unwillingly. For it is better to receive a slight reprimand than to perform an arduous task. Yeah, I don't know where he pulled that out of. I still don't know where he got it from. But I thought those were the words we lived by. But we were so happy, and there was just like, the childhood was so happy. So all of a sudden, I'm thrust into a world that's not New Orleans. And it was, broadly financial success America, New York. And it's very successful. People are making a lot of money, and they're so unhappy. They're so miserable. My most miserable college classmates knew they wanted to go to Wall Street the day they set foot on the campus. And I was like, something's wrong here. All those people going up to study economics, they had no interest in economics, so they go to work on Wall Street and have miserable lives. Rich, successful, but miserable lives. So right from the start, I have a view of that world that is a little different. I think it's screwed up. Why is this? Why is this success? And there's no question that leads to liar's poker. There's no question that leads in particular to a kind of armor that I had about that. They never persuaded me this was important. Even though they let me in, they made me a successful person for a few years, and they were going to give me a lot of money. I could never really buy in because it seemed so cockeyed miserable.
They screwed up and let in a happy person, and the result was the most scathing indictment.
That's exactly.
It's like they will never make that mistake again.
So and they will no. So they'll no them. There's some real truth to that. Yeah. And they couldn't understand. I've told you the story of. I've told you. They probably don't have any stories left to tell you that I haven't told you. But I can remember the bewilderment of the Wall Street people when I was wanting to write, wanting to publish stuff. I'd been writing some magazine pieces before I got there, couldn't make a living at it. I get this job, they can pay me a lot of money. It was kind of cool, and maybe you'd write about it one day. I was always kind of 1 foot in, 1 foot out. However, through very flukishly, I was like crazy successful for the first 18 months. And I could explain why that happened, but it had very little to do with me knowing anything. But they thought I knew what I was doing, and I didn't know what I was doing. But it was generating many, many tens of millions of dollars for the firm. And so I was sort of protected. And so I didn't think, oh, anybody's going to fire me. They couldn't fire me. I was too profitable. So I started writing stuff that, in retrospect, was reckless. I wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal, op-ed page, arguing that investment bankers were overpaid. And on the bottom it said, Michael Lewis is an associate at Salomon Brothers in London. And when I arrived at work the next day, the head of the whole company, International, was there ashen-faced, waiting for me, and saying, I felt bad. He looked so bad. He said, we've been up all night with the board of directors trying to figure out what to do about this because it's being reprinted all over the country in newspapers. And you can't say that we're overpaid. And I said, well, we are overpaid. And he said, yeah, but you can't say it. And he says, and it was like, what can you do to stop?
Wait, stop for a second. How old are you at this point?
24.
You're 24.
Yeah.
You're at a job in Wall Street. Is this your first real job out of college?
Real job out of college. I was
Depends
on how you count them, but I was a stock boy at the Wildenstein Art Gallery, and I wore a suit to work for 6 months, and I got tired of that. And then I worked as a cabinet maker's apprentice for 4 months, and then I led rich teenage girls, American girls, through Europe for 3 months. And then, except for that.
So this is the first one. You're making a handsome amount of money.
Yeah.
And your first impulse, at 24, making a lot of money, is to turn on institution and to suggest that actually you, and not just you could have written an article saying I'm overpaid.
Yeah. No.
No. We're all overpaid.
We're all over.
You're like Samson. You're going to take down everyone.
But I wasn't even thinking. I was thinking, how do I get an article in the Wall Street Journal? And I wasn't even thinking that, this is going to have some effect. It was like, this is an interesting point to make. We're overpaid. And why are we overpaid? And so that I laid that out, and I thought, my state of mind was such that I kind of thought when I walked into work the next day, they'd all be saying, my God, you got an article in the Wall Street Journal. That's so great. Nobody said that. Nobody said that. They said instead, you got to stop writing. And I said, I'm not going to stop writing. And so he said, okay, can you write under another name? So I wrote under my mother's maiden name for a long stretch. My mother's maiden name was Diana Bleecker Monroe, and I was Diana Bleecker. And that mollified them. They actually said no one will ever guess that a woman is a man around here. They don't think like that. And but when I finally kind of said to them, I'm out of here. I'm going to go write a book about Wall Street. I told them. Their response was not, you can't write about this, or you don't write about us, or we're afraid, or none of that. They actually didn't care. The bosses who were seeing me out the door. They were worried about my mental health. They took me in a room and said, we're just worried about you. You're going to make $500,000 next year and $1 million a year after that, and you might run the firm one day, they said. And I said, you're out of your mind. No, I don't know what I'm doing. You just don't know I don't know what I'm doing. And I really like doing that. And they couldn't understand where I was coming from. And where I was coming from was here. That's why they couldn't understand it. It was like, I remembered a happy place that wasn't like this. And so that, whatever it was about this childhood, it was still with me and protected me. Because otherwise, I'd have believed what they were saying about me and about the importance of this, and money would have become a substitute for something else, and I'd have just lived my life there. That's what would have happened.
Did you recently with us re-released Liar's Poker as an audiobook, which meant that you both had to go back and read it again. Am I right? Are you like me? Do you reread your old books or don't?
You don't reread them?
I don't. I haven't. Yeah.
Yeah, I can't.
No, can I? Yeah.
I can't.
But you would have had to.
You know, it's an odd thing that you can't, though, right? Because right before you finish the book, you're rereading it obsessively. You're rereading it, you're dreaming about it, you're thinking about it, you're going back and line editing it, you're doing, but the minute it's in print, I completely lose interest in it. Like to the point where book tours are painful for me. I just don't want to talk about it. And so I had to, so it's funny, I had to have flipped through it before I went on like the paperback book tour.
Yeah.
And I remember this because I was going on the paperback book tour for Liar's Poker. I had to fly back from London to New York, and I had the book on my lap. I thought, I got to remember what I read, because I can be on TV talking about it. And a kind of an oil man type from Texas comes and sits next to me, looks down, and says, "You reading that book?" And before I could stop him, he said, "I read that book. It sucked. Cynical bastard." And I remember thinking, I'm going to spend 8 hours trying to avoid him figuring out who I am. I remember flipping through it then, but just flipping through it, just so I didn't forget anecdotes, but never since. So what happened was, Jacob Weisberg, who's going to be up here in a couple of hours, and we've been talking about doing what you've been doing, which is an audiobook with Pushkin, which is actually a produced audiobook, which isn't just someone reading it, that it's more interesting than that. And you've gone so far as to, the voices of your characters are in the book. And I think I don't think I'll ever get quite there. I don't like recording when I'm interviewing. It makes the characters, they're not.
Michael, they make tape recorders that are this big.
I know.
Just put it there and you forget about it.
It makes people self-conscious. It makes people, and a lot of times I'm moving through space with them. I'm doing things with them because that's how I get to know them, and it's just hard. It just makes it a much less natural interaction. Anyway, so what are we going to do? If we're going to do one of these books, what are we going to do? And the rights to Liar's Poker reverted to me. And I thought, well, why don't we do this? We'll see if we'll start with something that's. And so the other part of this, the other piece of this is my daughter, Quinn, who's a junior at Harvard, had told me that friends of hers had been made to read the book by people they'd interned with on Wall Street because it was like still relevant somehow on Wall Street. And that was curious to me because I thought, how could that be? It's just it's changed so much. So the combination, I thought, well, let's see what's in here. And 3 months ago, we recorded it, and we released it a few weeks ago. And the experience was not what I expected. It was there's a reason you don't reread your books.
Wait. So let's break it down. You're rereading it for the first time in how many years?
33 years, 32 years.
So walk me through your reactions to the rediscovery of your own work.
Very similar to the experience I had yesterday when I went back to the Isidore Newman School, where I was for 13 years, and talked to students, and I was walking the halls of the Newman School. All of a sudden, I had these place associations, memories that I just didn't even know I had. Every corner of the place, there's some story. I opened the book, and I started reading, and like 2 paragraphs in, I thought, I remember what I was reading when I wrote that, and I was imitating it. And because it didn't sound quite like me. It was when I was reading The Education of Henry Adams. And I was reading The Education of Henry Adams because I thought, in preparation of writing this brutally frank memoir, and I don't know, I've never written a book. I've never written anything longer than a couple thousand words. I started to read other supposedly brutally frank memoirs. Confessions, Rousseau, The Education. I don't know, I had a stack of them. And so I had this odd experience as I was reading the first couple of chapters. The introduction, actually the first chapter I wrote last, so it wasn't the first chapter. It was like when you get to chapter 2 on. I could see like, now I'm Henry Adams. Oh, now I'm George Orwell. Oh, now I'm Mark Twain. Oh, now I'm Tom Wolfe. So I was hearing the voices of the writers whose book I was reading, and I was imitating. Not plagiarizing, just like their voices are in my head.
That book doesn't feel like a Michael Lewis book to you?
It gets more, as you get into it, there came a moment where I didn't think, oh, someone else. And I also thought, oh, this is less objectionable. And I know exactly where the moment was, and it was about mid-chapter 6. And
What's happening in that?
what is happening is interesting. It's the first time I'm ripping off a customer for Solomon Brothers. And I'm outraged I'm in this situation. I don't know that I'm ripping them off, but I'm ripping them off. And it's really funny, the story. The guy loses his job because of something I put him into. But I was so absorbed with my own experience, I forgot about how I was supposed to write it. And I just told it. And I was getting, what was happening is I was sending in chapters to the publisher, 2 at a time, and the response was so enthusiastic, I was starting to think, well, maybe I can do this, you know? I mean, what was actually, the backdrop of this, what was so odd, was what I'd sold the publishers was actually a history of Wall Street where I appeared at the end for a few pages. It was, the book ended up being something completely different than what I had intended, thank God. And I thought, at some point I sat down and I thought, well, actually my experience is I'm gonna try that. But I had one hand on other writers. You know, I had no sense I could just be myself. And what happened as I was writing it is a gathering confidence in just being myself, which since that book has never left me. You know, it's just that at some point, I don't know. So think about how different you are now from when you started writing. But here I am, a sweaty mess in the beginning, reading all these other writers, trying to figure out how you do this stuff, borrowing their voices. When I write a book now, I avoid reading things. I don't want anything in my head. I don't want anything interfering. I read the stuff that I have to read for the book, but I'm not, anything that might actually kind of influence how I don't read anything. And so I was getting to the point, middle of the book, where I was learning how to write a book as I was writing a book, which is not something you should do. You should know how to write a book before you start writing a book. I could see the moment where, oh, that's me. Yes, here we are. And off we went.
Yeah, something you said, I wanted to follow up on, you said, at the time you were writing Larry's Poker 33 years ago, you would have said that you were writing a book that was an angry book about, well, an indictment of Wall Street. Does it read to you today like an indictment of Wall Street?
No, it reads like it's a really funny book about Wall Street. Yeah. But funny, and I know. So here's a central truth about what we do. You think you wrote the book you wrote until the readers read your book and they tell you the book you wrote.
Yeah.
You write the words and the readers decide what they mean. And to the extent if you try to muscle them around too much, you just lose them. So you have no influence. That actually it's a mark of a good book, that you leave a hole for the reader to walk into and exercise some judgment about what the book is. And that you get radically different responses to a book is not a bad sign, it's a very good sign. All that's true about the book. About the moral consequences of my life, it does not speak well. You know, that I thought, if you'd have asked me going in, what's the purpose of what you're doing, aside from you want to be a writer and you want to have written a book or whatever, I had this thing that had eaten at me since I was at Princeton. And again, it comes back to this place. That this idea that you were supposed to sacrifice the best in you for some idea of success was really offensive to me. I had friends who had real passions when they were undergraduates. A roommate who was just born to be an oceanographer, spent his summers in Woods Hole, talked about nothing but what was underwater, and junior year he hears about Goldman Sachs and he's supposed to go work at Goldman Sachs, and just makes a beeline for Wall Street and spends his career as a money manager and, you know, didn't care one way or another about what he did. I watched people make that mistake, and I thought, if I just demystify this for people and show how silly it kind of is, that my roommate will read this and he'll just go be an oceanographer. I think, I don't need to do this. This is not important work. it's a little silly. You're not adding a whole lot of value to the world here. Yeah, you can make money. Instead, what happened was, it happened right away. Like 4 months after Liar's Poker was published, I had 1,000 letters, and I mean 1,000 letters from college students saying, "Dear Mr. Lewis, I read your book about how to get ahead on Wall Street, and I'm more enthusiastic than ever about it. And thank you for writing it. And can you give me any more tips that aren't in the book?" It's also true that people, this culture especially, the English don't do this, but we do it, turn almost every book into a how-to book. That there's this, that people just don't have a read, that they want to find the lessons in the book. And so the lessons in the book was how to get ahead on Wall Street. So that has, that surprised me, but subsequently I've seen those sorts of things happen with other books where people just read them in a completely different way than I thought they would.
Well, also, the youthful, now, keep in mind, I think Liar's Poker is absolutely brilliant, but the youthful mistake you made was in thinking that in showing the kind of superficiality and pointlessness of Wall Street, you were doing them a disservice. But in fact, that's what they needed to be more appealing. In other words, what kids thought was that Wall Street makes you a lot of money, but it's deadly boring. And what you said, no, actually, it's kind of fun. It's like crazy and nutty. And they're like, wow, you mean I can both make money and continue to be a frat boy?
Yes.
And it'll all work out. Yeah. That's what you were telling them.
Yeah, that's...
When does the movie Wall Street come out?
Around that time.
Because the movie Wall Street,
might have
of course,
preceded it.
And what's the one that Leo DiCaprio did?
Wolf of Wall Street.
Wolf of Wall Street.
That came out much later.
Yeah, that's
right.
But they're all, there are 3 points on the continuum, because all of those, I'm not saying, those 2 movies are doing a much more grandiose and absurd version of the same thing, which is they're pretending that what being an investment banker at Wall Street is all of this hijinks. And in fact, like, there's a scene, the famous scene where Leo DiCaprio's there with Matthew McConaughey, and Matthew McConaughey's doing the chest pounding. It's like, it's just, they're having 3 martinis in the middle of the day. This is not happening.
No, that's not what happened.
Never happened.
No. So anyway, it did have this odd effect. And reading it over, so the first thought was, wow, I can't believe I got away with this, like that this book worked. I was cringing at what I was reading. I was taking a pen to it, and Julia Barton, our editor, had to kind of stop me from changing the book because I would have changed quite a bit about the book. So that was the first reaction to it was that. The second reaction to it was how much funnier I was when I didn't think I was being funny than when I thought I was being funny. When I thought I was being funny, it wasn't very funny. Like, I had no sense. I know as I was writing it, I was just vastly amused by myself. I was laughing the whole time. And the parts where I thought I was most amused by myself were not the parts that most amused the reader. The next thought I had was how much material, I could see places where I'd actually screwed up the story. And the truth about it, the whole thing is, the material was so good, it was idiot-proof. That I had such good material that I could make a lot of mistakes and get away with it.
Yeah.
It was, I just saw all the mistakes as I went through it.
The genius, it has, let's be clear, one of the greatest titles. My theory of great titles. All great titles book titles follow one simple rule, which is there must be a puzzling and pleasing contradiction between the two-word titles or 3-word titles. There must be, between the 2 nouns in the title, there must be a pleasing and puzzling contradiction. Silent Spring. Perfect. Unsafe at any speed. Well, make any sense. Yeah. Liar's Poker. Poker is a game in which we lie. Yeah. So what does a game of liars look like when it's played by liars? Yeah. Wow. Yeah. What does that mean?
So
fantastic.
You've already thought more about my title than I thought about it ever. And that one of the things we did when I was starting to record the book is I went into our storage facility. When I do a book, I toss everything into a box toss the box into the attic when it's done. And so I didn't know what was in the Liar's Poker box. And I opened the Liar's Poker box, and at the top was the manila folder which just said title ideas on it. And it was, it had a lot of stuff in it, but they were all written out on the front. That before it was Liar's Poker, it was almost Bonds of Passion.
You literally, Mike,
So
if you'd called it that, you literally wouldn't be on the stage.
No, I know. So there were like 50 really bad titles before that one became, so that happens. Yeah, that happens. Anyway, what are we doing? I thought we were gonna let some other people.
Well, we have 1 minute and 48 seconds left, so you could give us one more story, or we can ask one question.
Let's do a question.
Audience, one question from the audience. The pressure's really high. It's because we only have room for one. Does anyone want to step up? All right.
Oh, right. So we do a little. So we got a minute. I got a minute and 30. So I say this, that of all the books I've written, the one where if you'd put a camera on me while I was writing it, where I looked most like a writer in a movie, it was The Premonition. I've never felt so much like just a conduit, like just the story just flowed through me. And I think there was I can't tell you very much about the book in a minute, but I can tell you about the backstory of the book a bit. So it's supposedly about the pandemic. It's actually not about the pandemic. It's about everything leading up to the pandemic. It's sort of like through three characters, we are seeing the glitches in our system that lead to the response that we have. And I had in mind before I wrote the book, before the pandemic, I had this idea that I was going to my next book, I was just going to start with a character and let the story worry about itself, and see just a character that I found so compelling that we would follow that character anywhere, and a character in a situation. And I actually had the character and the situation, and then the pandemic happens. So I had that at the back of my mind going into the pandemic. I'd also written a book called The Fifth Risk, which is all about the risk mechanism management of the federal government and how we had sort of neglected it for generations, and what would happen if something bad happened. So that's the kind of ingredients that are going into this. And I found, I think, three of the best characters that I've ever had, and certainly the woman at the center of the book is maybe the best character I've ever written. And and so what I discovered was, actually, that's the joy. That's where I get the joy, writing about the characters. It was just the most, it sounds weird because we were in the middle of this grim period, but the 9 months I was working on it, the 6 months I was writing it, easily the most joyful 6 months I've ever had as a writer. And I think it comes off the page. It's like a fun book about the pandemic, and right?
Would you, wait, I shouldn't say anything. Let's do it can we?
We got people coming on after us is the problem, I think. Yeah.
Can we cheat and do one more question? No? No.
Can't, got to cut it off. What were you going to say, though? You can wrap it up here.
Oh, I should wrap it up, yeah. Well, no, I was going to ask you whether if you were writing a book about the pandemic today, how different does it look?
It's such a dreary subject, the pandemic itself, but the stuff leading up to the pandemic is so interesting. So I don't think I would write a book about the pandemic. So I don't know. I hadn't even thought about it. I knew I was going to do this. The trick was I was going to tell everybody it was a book about the pandemic, and it wasn't. But so I don't know. I don't know. I mean, it's still a failed response. You go about analyzing the failed response maybe in a slightly different way.
Yeah. Michael, I think we have to. People are looking at me with daggers in their eyes. So I want to thank you for being part of our continuing conversation. Like I said, this is probably our 7th or 8th time. And thank you all.
Thank you.